All right, what is up, everybody? Episode 106. Welcome to Pursuit of Balance with your host, with the mostest, Corey. All right, we're going to talk about the relationship between ribcage and pelvis and their influence on your mobility. We're going to talk a little bit about hip and shoulder rotation, because a lot of times we think about mobility in a very linear fashion, but there's a lot of rotation demand, and then we're going to kind of tie that all in together with how both of those are going to influence each other with like what the pelvis and ribcage position does to the shoulder and the hip joint, and how your breathing and your level of stress can influence those positions as well. So the first thing to kind of jump right into it is when you look at your pelvis and you look at the ribcage, my favorite way to explain this to people is pelvis is kind of the floor, right? It's the foundation, it's the basement, it's the hub for obviously everything below the legs, but it also kind of accentuates how the spine angle and position is going to sit. And then obviously moving upstairs, you're looking at more kind of rib cage and head. So one of the big things that we try to get people to understand and obviously create is a better stacking of the rib cage and the pelvis, and obviously the head position above the rib cage. But today I'm going to talk mainly more about the rib cage and pelvis and how those influence your mobility and how those also influence your breathing patterns, right? Now, a lot of this stuff that I talk about today is bidirectional. So like, very shallow breathing could be an influence of a very stressed out life, which could put you into a more inhalation type of bias, but like blah, 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 blah. So, but understand that it's like the chicken or the egg is not really what I want to talk about today. I just want to talk about how these things influence each other, and then obviously what is kind of the remedy for fixing these issues. So I'm going to use myself as a story first, because I have what a lot of people have, which is a anterior tilt, an anterior shift, a little bit of extension through the rib cage, causing more lordotic curve in the lumbar spine, which in English is more extension. It looks like I'm arching my back normally, right? It almost looks like I have a pooch belly sometimes too, right? It's like there's people that have abs that look like they have a belly at the same time. That's going to be generally the position of the pelvis and the position of the rib cage, and that extra extension that you get when you kind of have that bowed back, and what that does. So the first thing, an anterior tilt and shift are two different things. So if you were to look at somebody laterally, so if you were to take a picture of yourself side by side in a mirror or a phone, whatever, and you were to see that your center of gravity is pushed forward, so meaning your hips are more past or like above your toes versus your midfoot to heel, that's your body being shifted forward, right? So you would see that someone would have maybe tighter calves or tighter hip flexor or stiffer lower back. They tend to be in this kind of anterior shift, and that's a compensation, obviously. An anterior tilt is where the pelvis can still be necessarily neutral, not being forward or backwards, but it's tilted. Like, so I know kind of for those in the YouTube video watching this, you can see this, but the explanation everyone likes to give is imagine a bucket of water, right? A bucket of water sitting in a neutral state is fine. When it tilts it forward, you're spilling water out of the front. When you tilt it backwards into a posterior tilt, you're spilling it backwards. So the goal is to try to find this neutral foundation, right? So getting our pelvis to be in the right position. So the thing is like, okay, well, what influences these positions? So when you think about like your adductor, obviously a little bit more superior and medial fiber. When you look at all the hip flexors, you look at some of the TFL, these muscles that internally rotate or flex the hip, if those are tight or kind of in a sense on because they're trying to create more stability because maybe they're lacking it somewhere else, they're going to take the pelvis and they're always going to want to hold it in a short position. So imagine if I gave you guys like a rubber band, right? A very small, strong rubber band, and I tied it to 2 points. There's going to be more tension between those 2 points, right? So if you think about the pelvis being one side of that attachment for these fibers that I'm talking about, these muscle groups, you're going to see that pelvis is always going to want to be pulled down and forward, because that's where that muscle, those muscles, the hip flexors and the internal rotators are shorter. So by doing that, you're putting yourself in a position of more lumbar extension. So your lower back is going to have more curve, right? So it's going to look like you're almost kind of sticking your belly out. It's going to load up some of the erectors and lower back muscles, and it's going to put the glutes and the hamstrings and the abs in a more lengthened position, and mainly a position that's going to inhibit their ability to fully contract. When you look at fixing your range of motion, it is a mixture of obviously having enough length and an environment to be able to get to certain positions, but it's mainly about the ability to be able to get there with contraction and breath and control. So if I can't contract my glutes when I do a glute bridge, because I'll give you an example, like a lot of people do glute bridges and they still look like they're extending their hips, but they're also extending their lower back because their pelvic position is not going to be oriented the right way. So what that does is it obviously makes it really hard for us to get the core and the glutes to become strong, which is most of you probably know if you know anything about health or fitness, that those are two areas you probably want to have really, really strong as far as trunk stability, your ability to extend the hips, and so forth, so on. When you look at the anterior tilt, the hamstring is connected to the back of your pelvis, right? So if I had a muscle that was attached to the back side of this quote unquote bucket, for those that are listening to this podcast, if I took that bucket and I tilted it forward, you're going to actually make that anchor point, that attachment point, farther than it was previous, right? So its neutral position would be down a little bit. This anterior tilt is going to create a little bit more of a stretch. So there's a lot of people, we were doing this in our team meeting today, going over like the active straight leg raise test, that when they do their straight leg raise laying on the floor, lifting one leg with the knees fully extended and the toes pulled back, that they get to 90 or they get to 70 degrees of flexion, and then suddenly you have them pull down on their hand or create some more stability at the trunk and the core, and then they can get to 90. What that basically means is a lot of times we think we have tight hamstrings when in reality we just have a muscle that's stuck in a lengthened position. If I took a rubber band and I stretched it a little bit and I just held that tension there, and then I said, well, let's stretch it more, it's not going to go as far because it already has some element of stretching going on previous. So what we need to do to really fix these quote unquote tight hamstrings is just get the pelvis to come backwards, right? So if I can create a little bit more of a posterior tilt for the pelvis, so I can get the core and the glutes and all those other things to be able to kind of fire correctly, I can relieve some of the tension that's being put on the hamstring. The hamstring is kind of like neuromuscular. It's just kind of stuck in this tonic hold, right? It's just like basically trying to create the stability for us because it's counteracting what the hip flexors and the internal rotators of the front side are trying to do. So that makes, obviously, it's kind of a shit show for a lot of reasons, right? Then when we move upstairs a little bit, you look at the rib cage. The rib cage, if I were to take basically this bucket, that I've been using for the hips that's facing upwards, imagine I take the same bucket, but I had it facing down. There's no more water in this thing. I want these things to be perfectly stacked. So if I connected both of these, they would have a nice flush seal all the way around. If I took that top bucket in my rib cage and I just tilted it backwards where it looks like my rib flare. So you'll see this with a lot of people that, like, when you're standing and you may be doing an overhead test or something like that, you see, I always call it the rib boobs. Like, if you see the rib cage protruding out of the shirt or just like sticking out of their skin, that means that rib cage is kind of stuck in extension too. And what that does is, not only because when you arch your lower back, it's very natural for your rib cage to kind of come back as well. So you create a lot of posterior compression under the shoulder blades, right? So like the thoracolumbar fascia, the lats, those lower traps, the rhomboids even a little bit. These muscles are kind of getting stuck in this position to create compression because they're always in this kind of shortened position all the time. And then, naturally, a lot of times we think like, oh, I have a tight overhead position. Well, a lot of times that could be the orientation of what the rib cage is doing for the shoulder blade and blah, 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 blah. So for like my situation and what a lot of people do when they're in this anterior overextended position, because tight hip flexors, tight internal rotators of the hip, tight mid to lower back, you're going to create basically a system that's always going to be overloading the lumbar and kind of lower thoracic spine, right? So that another thing that we see that's doubled down from this bidirectional chicken or egg, like we were talking about earlier, is this is also a state for somebody that is more sympathetic to naturally become in. You'll see that your posture will change based off your mental state, your emotional state, right? So if someone is, when you take a breath in, inhaling is sympathetic. Exhaling is parasympathetic. And I talked about this a handful of episodes ago when I was talking about the breathing relationship to ribcage and pelvis orientation. I want to bring this back up today. If you're someone that's in extended position, anterior tilt or overextended ribcage, your body is stuck from a posture perspective in a more inhalation bias, meaning it's actually more mechanically advantageous to be in this extended position to get a big breath in. But it's a mechanical disadvantage to be able to actually create exhalation. When you think about breathing out, I want you to pay attention to what your body does. If you're sitting down in a car, you're sitting down or walking, whatever, it doesn't matter the position. Take a big breath in. You see how your rib cage kind of sticks out, your belly, your chest opens up, your arms externally rotate, they slightly maybe even abduct. When you exhale, it's very easy for things to internally rotate, adduct, and then more importantly, kind of start to flex back down. And when you hold and you put your hands on your stomach and you breathe out, you feel the core is one of those things that facilitates that. So the diaphragm is a part of your core. So in order to get the right position to then properly move and engage the right muscles, the breathing is going to be the thing that's going to determine that. And that's just overall throughout the course of your day and life based off how your breathing mechanics look, but then also how you're going about your massage therapy, your soft tissue work, your stretching work, your corrective exercise. The breathing is the thing that's going to facilitate the environment or the position that you want to create. So for someone like me, I need to really be mindful of my breathing and mindful of my exhalation when I'm doing these drills, because that's that thing that's going to tell the nervous system to let the pelvis come back a little bit so I can shut off some of the tension in the hip flexors, let the core turn on, let the rib cage drop back down, find a relatively more neutral position for the pelvis and the rib cage and spine to be in, and then go about those movements or whatever correctives I'm doing, but maintaining the breath cycle and the brace within that new position. If I'm just doing, this is one thing we see with like cool down stretches. I think one of the most underrated things we see is like just not taking a second to like walk around and let your breath come back down. Because if you're still like hyperventilating and trying to stretch, you're not doing anything to facilitate any type of relaxation that, you know, we would want to see from a cool down stretch. I mean, that's the whole purpose, is to create a more parasympathetic state for your body to relax and then lengthen and, you know, create new positions, whatever it might be. So this is obviously something that can then lead to the head, right? So when you look at the hips and the shoulders, right, your hips need to be able to externally rotate and internally rotate, and so do the shoulders. Rotation is a lost subject. It's becoming more mainstream and popular now in my space, which is good to see, because for the longest time when I first started training, I didn't really talk about rotation at all. But when you think about it, by definition, everything is a rotational movement. When I squat, there is a need for external rotation to get to the bottom of my squat. When I hinge for a deadlift, for a Romanian deadlift, for example, I need to have enough internal rotation to do that. When I walk around or run or jog, like I need to have enough internal and external rotation to get through every step correctly without compensating from my knees or my back or my pelvis. So think about it this way. If you were to lie down on your back and you were to put your arm out to the side where your elbow is down on the floor, level with your shoulder joint, and I were to try to get the back of my arm or fist to touch the floor, I should be able to get about 90 degrees of external rotation, right? And when we go to internal, we want to see roughly about the same thing, but at least 70 degrees. When you look at the hips, if you were to lay down continuously still on your back and you were to bring your knee up like you're coming up towards your chest, but your knee is directly over your hip, bringing your foot across your body, so in would be external rotation. You want to have about 45, I would say about 40 to 50 degrees of external rotation. And when you look at internal, you want to be able to get about 30 to 40 degrees. So there's a less demand for internal rotation of both the shoulder and the hip. But when you think about a squat, when you go to look at it in a very slow motion camera, like you would see that there is a degree of external rotation that's needed at the beginning of the squat. Then the middle part of the squat comes a little bit of internal, and then the very bottom, in order to keep those kind of knee out position that you hear a lot of coaches give as cues, that's an external rotation demand. So if you have a hard time getting to the bottom of your squat and staying there with good foot position, good knee tracking position, and a nice neutral spine, you are probably missing external rotation at its end range. So your compensation for your squat is either to raise your heels to cheat the system a little bit for ankle and better pelvic position, or to widen your stance and turn your feet out and point your toes out, because that's going to bias away, because you're just kind of, in a sense, creating fake external rotation because you're just putting a position that's there. But the problem with that is you lose the contractibility of the glutes because they're a little bit more shortened just to begin with. A muscle is always strongest in its mid-range, and that's why certain positions we like to have the ability for the muscle to create the stability versus your stance or your position to do that thing. But then overhead tube. So I'll give you another example kind of related to this rib cage and anterior tilt of the pelvis. If you're someone that's very overextended at the hips and the rib cage, me being kind of big chest, and I've always been like, okay, I'm going to train a lot of my upper back and do these things so I can kind of prevent me having to slouch posture. I'm overextended, right? Which means that I have a lot of extension in my spine and my head and my rib cage. So if you were to look at my posture for someone from a naked eye, at an unprofessional eye, you would think that I have really good posture. But obviously, me knowing myself, and if I were to talk to a professional, they would see what kind of extension bias that I just like naturally put in. I have great external rotation on my shoulders. And the reason why is I'm already in this extended position. So it's actually easier for me mechanically to get to these positions. When I look at something like, what would be the best way to say it? Like a forward head, slouch posture, or posterior tilt. See, the people that kind of look like they're just kind of shorter and like secluded or tilted back or flatter back, or, you know, chest and shoulders are forward and the head is forward, they're going to be already kind of primed for internal rotation. They would have more advantage in internal rotation, and the reason why is because that body is already in that position. So they're going to have a hard time with inhalation. They're going to have a hard time with external rotation. They're going to have a harder time with some of those things overhead. Now, when you look at the downstairs, the hip side of this conversation, when my hips are anteriorly tilted, you're already putting your hips into a little bit of internal rotation. Because if you're thinking about the opposite motion, that's exactly what's happening. So, there's a lot of biomechanics and therapists that will say, like, it's hard to go where you already are. So if my body is in a state of internal rotation already, it's hard for me to, during an assessment, to see if I have true good hip internal rotation or bad hip internal rotation because I'm already in those positions. And that's kind of like the hamstring example. It's like if I'm already lengthened, it's hard for me to really have a true assessment on the length if I'm not in the right position. So someone that's posteriorly tilted at the hips is going to have a harder time getting into external rotation a little bit because maybe they're already there enough, right? So it won't give them a true score. And that's the same thing on the hips. So to kind of tie all this stuff together, because I know it kind of feels like maybe a little random of like, why the fuck are we talking about this anyways? But the relationship between the hips, the rib cage, and the head, and the ability to rotate your shoulders is going to be one of the things that's going to be the biggest game changer for, mitigating pain so you can move more freely because your body is designed to be able to rotate. And I'm not talking about rotating in the aspect of like swinging a golf club. I'm talking about every movement that you do has an element of rotation. You doing a push-up, your elbows come in on the way down and they flare out a little bit on the way up. When you're doing a pull-up, your elbows come into the body and they flare out a little bit on the way back up. So there's always a degree of rotation for every movement, squats, deadlifts, running. And even though these movements feel linear because they are quote-unquote forward and backwards or up and down, when you're missing rotation, you're going to have compensatory patterns that are going to show up that naturally just go and move to the chassis. Your chassis is your hips, your rib cage, your head, and the spine that connects the whole thing together. So if you feel like you're trying to do a lot of mobility work or whatever the routine that you have set out for yourself and you're not seeing a lot of improvement, my thing that I always like to come back to is like, let's just kind of reassess how your static position looks with the spine, how the hips and the rib cage kind of look and orient to each other. So from like a frontal view or a lateral point of view, you can kind of have a good idea of like someone's kind of body archetype in a sense. Where is the head? Are my ears over my toes? Are my ears over my heels and my midfoot? Like, kind of give you an idea of like where the position and the tension is going to be. Because if my body statically is in a wrong place, there's going to be plenty of muscles that are just going to hold on for dear life, both in lengthened and shortened positions. So trying to find the balance of that thing. But understand that if you are someone that is more overly extended, tight hip flexors, tight internal rotators, things like that, you are going to generally have a more inhalation bias. So you're going to be in a position where your posture is going to be conducive to the way you breathe and the way you move. And if you're the opposite, where you're more posteriorly tilted, flat back, dropped rib cage, forward shoulders, forward head position, you might be on the opposite scenario of those things. So don't be afraid to just look at things as more at a systematic level of like statically and dynamically, how are you moving? How are you breathing? What does your level of stress look like? I had a guy that we signed up yesterday that was, he's been in and out of the gym. He's been doing cardio stuff pretty consistently, but he's like, I've done it every time I get back into strength training, I like re-injure myself. And the guy was a 9 out of 10 on stress as his average, right? So you can manage or imagine when someone's chronically stressed, they have this kind of sympathetic tone to them, meaning like they're just stuck in this place of just kind of being tense, right? And that tension is not, it's a compensatory pattern. It's your body saying, well, fuck, like you're freaking out both physically or mentally or emotionally, doesn't know. So I'm going to make us tight to kind of protect us or get us ready for whatever we're doing. You want your body to be able to have a balance between tension and relaxation and fast and feminine. Like, there's a balance between everything, yin and yang. So when your body is holding tension everywhere, it's hard to move well without creating a lot of compensations in those movement patterns. So breathing is like the thing that if you can take away from anything from the conversation I just talked about for the last 20 minutes, like pay attention to your breathing patterns and how much those affect your stretching, your mobility work, your posture overall, your ability to internally rotate and externally rotate, flex, extend, like all this shit that we're talking about is generally going to be based off the foundation of kind of where the body's sitting, because your posture changes based off your breathing and most importantly your movement and position you give it every day. Like if I run a lot every day, my body's going to be really good about creating range of motion in the range that I need to use. Doesn't mean that runners have the most optimal range of motion for running all the time. They could be still compensating, But naturally, your body generally likes to veer towards like whatever you're giving it as a constant stimulus, is going to be the thing that's going to want to adapt to create a better, quote unquote mobility range for, right? All right, guys. Well, that is it. I hope you guys got some good little nuggets out of that one. I will be in Maui next week, actually, drinking Mai Tais, so I will not be here next Friday. So I'll see you guys in 2 weeks. Take care.